because the culture wars, you date them from like 1960 to the 1990s, that it coincides basically with the peak of rock music, after which it dies. And I wonder if that's just pure coincidence. And I suspect it isn't, but I don't have a good reason for why I feel
Yeah.
that way.
Yeah, I haven't at a sort of academic level tried to make that connection, but I think you're onto something for sure. Yeah.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga. Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le bunga, bunga. Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. Today, I'm very happy to be able to talk about a subject that comes up a lot in this podcast, but we haven't really dealt with it deliberately, certainly not in terms of dealing with the history of it. We're talking about the culture wars, and I'm delighted to be joined by Andrew Hartman, who is professor of history at Illinois State University and the author of several books, including the one in particular that I'd like to focus on today called A War for the Soul of America, A History of the Culture Wars. He's also got a new book coming out, I think, very soon called Karl Marx in America, but that will have to remain for another time. I'm sure listeners' interest is piqued by that title, but for now, it's the Culture Wars. Hi, Andrew.
Hi, thanks for having me on. This should be fun.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this. And your book, I guess, pointed me in the direction of some answers, I guess, that I have, or answers to questions that I have about the culture wars. And I'm going to start with a really dumb question, which is, who started it? When I say culture wars, I guess we're talking about the stuff that your book mainly deals with, which is the culture wars which ran from the 60s to the 1990s, more or less.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a good question, actually. And it's not just sort of like esoteric in the sense that most people on the left, most liberals, think it's something that conservatives care about, that conservatives started. And certainly conservatives, since at least the 70s or 80s, have made the most of the culture wars in terms of tying it to electoral politics. But the argument I make in the book, and I stand by this argument, is that the culture wars were started probably unintentionally to some degree by the left or by liberals, by the sort of coterie of movements that emerged in the 1960s known as the New Left. The liberation movements ranging from civil rights, which morphed into the Black Power movement, Chicano Power, American Indian movement, feminism, gay liberation, counterculture, anti-war protest, all of this sort of came together in the 60s and after and changed a lot of the sort of cultural norms that had long governed American society to the degree that the right emerged and got organized to challenge these new norms. So I think the left started it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because obviously the first chapter is about the right. It's actually a very good chapter about the emergence of the neoconservatives, which I think is worth reading in its own right.
Well, chapter 1 is about the new left. Chapter 2 is about the neoconservatives. So I don't want to be pedantic about my book, but
you have every right to be so. I mean, that's the
point. But I do make the case that neoconservatism emerged in direct response to the new left, out of a sort of centrist liberalism. Obviously, some neoconservatives were on the left. A lot of them were Trotskyists, but really emerged out of a sort of centrist liberalism that was angry at the emergence of a new left that was challenging traditional norms that had been so successful for liberals of the sort like Irving Kristol or like Norman Podhoretz, who had been either on the left or liberals and who had sort of challenged basic frameworks in American society earlier in their life, but had grown very sort of accustomed to the way in which American norms had sort of created a sediment in the 1950s and 60s. And so when Black Power activists or gay liberationists emerged to challenge the America that they had grown to love, they moved to the right and developed a whole way of speaking about culture that shaped conservatism more broadly speaking.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a story which kind of comes through subterraneously in the book about it actually, in some ways, being about the undoing of liberalism. But I want to come back to that in a bit, because I want to continue with my very basic questions, not taking the
Yes.
notion of culture wars for granted or as read, and trying to break it down. Because I think there's a lot that we talk about as being culture wars, and maybe they are, maybe they aren't, and I want to come on to that as well. But where did the culture wars take place? Where are the sites of battles? I think a lot of it is talked about as being the 80s and 90s campus wars, but your book suggests that it's beyond that.
Yeah, obviously the campus is crucial. A lot of my book deals with those now pretty well-known battles over the canon, over how history's taught. But those battles extend into the public schools, the secondary schools, so on down to younger children and how they're taught history, how they're taught English. Those battles also encompassed Hollywood, music, um, more high art, aesthetics, religion, like not just how religious people responded to culture, but religious institutions themselves. And then of course into the political arena more specifically. Um, there were congressional hearings on a lot of these matters, and then politicians, including presidents, leveraged culture war issues to attract voters. Political groups leveraged culture war issues to raise money. That was a big deal. Um, so media in general, educational institutions, politics, the whole range.
Yeah, and this was obviously a long running war, with many different battles and skirmishes. And I mean, in the book, you recount various different, yeah, I think you even call them skirmishes or various moments of conflict, of contestation around whatever it might be. Something springs up. Can you maybe give us some examples, or maybe some of your favorite examples of the culture wars from the '60s on?
Sure. There's so many. And that was kind of what made the book so interesting, is like researching and detailing all of these many interesting battles, interesting in their own right, but then sort of tying them all, knitting it all together into one story or one analytical framework. Some of my favorites were the way in which conservatives, religious right in particular, responded to provocative art that happened to be tangentially funded by the National Endowment for the Arts during the 1980s. So here I'm talking about Andres Serrano's infamous Piss Christ, which was a photograph of a jar of his urine that had a crucifix in it, commentary on his Catholic upbringing. Or the fact that sort of through the back door, the NEA had also funded an installation of Robert Mapplethorpe's homoerotic and oftentimes sadistic photography. A hilarious bit from that little culture war in the 1980s is that Jesse Helms, who was a big time culture warrior in the Senate, used to carry around little postcards of Robert Mapplethorpe images that he would pass around to his political allies saying, look at how horrible this is. He never failed to pass them around. um,
And nothing like
other,
carrying around photos of gay S&M stuff in
yeah,
your
yeah.
pocket to show that you're a real conservative.
Yes, especially of the religious right type. Some others that were really interesting to me, um, in particular, were the battle over the canon at Stanford University. So in 1987, Stanford students had protested the sort of like core reading list that all freshmen had to read their first year at Stanford, on the basis that the reading list was just dead white Europeans, men. And so Stanford revised this core reading list, and this like simple sort of curricular act created a national controversy that had people all over the country commenting on like it represented the demise of Western civilization. Another really interesting one to me was the battle over the national history standards. This happened a little bit later in the sort of early to mid 1990s. Lynn Cheney, who was the elder Bush's chair of the National Endowment for the Humanities, had endowed some money to a group out of UCLA to create national history standards. This was part of her, as a conservative, part of her mission to put together a more standardized history curriculum for the public schools across the nation. One of the leading historians on that project was Gary Nash, a social historian at UCLA. But the project included lots of historians, lots of educators, and they put together these standards, which for historians at the time would have seemed rather basic, a sort of extension of how historians had practiced history in the university for several decades. But Cheney didn't like many aspects of the standards. And so even though she had sort of given the green light to fund the creation of them, she became their first and chief critic, and wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal soon after she had first read the standards, even before they had been published, saying that this was the end of history as we know it. This type of thing created a huge national controversy. I found that really interesting. Even Rush Limbaugh, the notorious right-wing AM radio pundit, had a whole segment on this in which he declared that, what history is? History is what happened. It's the facts, nothing more. So I found that one really interesting. And sort of like an extension of the history wars in the 90s was the pretty major skirmish over a Smithsonian Air and Space Museum effort to display the Enola Gay, the B-29 bomber that had dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The curators and the historians at work on the original script had created a pretty complex script that told that sort of operated around two narratives. One was that the historians had long debated whether the United States actually needed to drop the atomic bombs in order to finish off Japan and win the war in the Pacific. And the other included sort of details of the blast site with accounts from some of the witnesses and victims and artifacts from the blast site. And so the script itself, some veterans and veterans groups, including the American Legion, got a hold of it and made a national controversy of it, such that Congress made sure that the Smithsonian, or the Air and Space Museum specifically, all funds would be cut off if they put that script into motion in their museum. And so the Enola Gay was exhibited without any sort of surrounding exhibit.
Yeah, I mean, particularly that last one made me think about the way the motivation for lots of kind of actors in the culture war being motivated by a sense of esteem, needing to defend their sense of esteem, and that goes for left and for right. And that in that particular case, it's veterans wanting to say that their cause in the Second World War was just, and therefore the bombing of Hiroshima was just, and so on. And it's all kind of very much a question of a sort of wounded ego which pervades this, which I find it interesting, and maybe that's something we can also return to in a bit. But so obviously in writing a history of the culture wars, you're going to set parameters for what's included and what is excluded. And the question which springs to my mind, particularly looking at the culture wars today, is what is the culture in culture war? What distinguishes it from other kinds of collective struggle and polarization? What distinguishes it from class war, from ethnic war, or from kind of politics in general? The examples that you gave, I think, would lead us to an easy answer, right? Because the examples you gave are about education, about secondary and tertiary education, about art, that are about history and memory. So you can go, okay, well, that's all culture. But there's other things which kind of maybe don't fit so neatly into what would be considered, narrowly speaking, culture. They're about race, they're about gender, about sexuality, and so on. So what's the culture in culture war?
That's a good question. So any Anybody who has gone to graduate school in history or other related humanities disciplines over the last 30 or 40 years has learned all about this thing known as the cultural turn. And in a narrow aspect, what is meant by that is the turn to studying culture as a form of power. And so I think there is this very real sense that emerges in the middle to late 20th century, not just amongst academics, but also amongst sort of lots and lots of people, that culture has power. Patrick Buchanan, who's a key figure in my book, in fact, gave me the title of the book, A War for the Soul of America, with his 1992 infamous speech at the Republican National Convention of that year. He once said that culture is the Ho Chi Minh Trail to power.
Friends, this election is about more than who gets what. It is about who we are. It is about what we believe and what we stand for as Americans. There is a religious war going on in this country. It is a cultural war as critical to the kind of nation we shall be as the Cold War itself, for this war is for the soul of America. And in that struggle for the soul of America, Clinton and Clinton are on the other side, and George Bush is on our side.
And I think lots of people agreed with this. And so culture in this sense is, it's about representation. The basic way in which I frame the book is that the culture wars are these arguments or debates about what it means to be an American. Now, this is a debate that goes to the very heart of American history, going all the way back to 1776, because the United States is a nation that was formed not on any kind of voc, not on any kind of like rooted people or ethnicity or nationality even, but rather on ideas. But of course, those ideas, such as freedom or the pursuit of happiness, have always been highly contested ideas, and not everybody has always been accepted as having access to those ideas. Increasingly across American history, but in particular during the 20th century, more and more people gained access to the notion that they were an American and these ideas. And oftentimes it was through culture or through the representation of identity, of particular identities, such as, say, Black identity, in relation to the larger umbrella American identity, that caused a lot of conflict. And so when you think about the culture wars, I often think about these are just sort of like battles, scrums, fights, shouting matches over representation, over how people get represented in relation to the nation. And so, like, one of my favorite culture wars stories that I failed to mention earlier is the major controversy that emerged out of Martin Scorsese's film, The Last Temptation of Christ. Here's Scorsese just trying to make a film that was really interesting to him, premised on a novel that reinterpreted the Jesus Christ story, that made Jesus seem more fallible than perhaps many people wanted to believe, that made Jesus especially seem like somebody who was like tempted by sex, the last temptation, right? And lots of conservative Christians, even well before the film came out, were sort of deeply opposed to this interpretation, because it represented Jesus, who had become so important to them, not just as Christians, but also as Americans. There's this sort of like civic Christianity that is very deeply rooted in how many Americans define themselves. And they were deeply opposed to this. They didn't even want the film to be produced, to be made, to be shown. So to me, that's like one example of how, I mean, I think most people would consider a Hollywood film an actual sort of an actual sort of artifact of culture, but just one of these many representations that people struggled over.
So, I mean, it's interesting, actually. This makes me think whether culture wars are particularly a U.S. American phenomenon. Obviously, the term culture war comes from 19th century Germany, and so obviously it kind of pre-exists the kind of U.S. phenomenon. But do you think there's something particularly U.S. American about it? I can draw and think of examples of culture war elsewhere. I mean, here where I live in Brazil, there have definitely been culture wars. There's ongoing culture wars between a kind of progressive, what used to be kind of the progressive mainstream, and its challenge from the conservative, often evangelical right. And it's a culture war because it's a conflict over ways of living, right? But they're not done in dialogue into what it means to be Brazilian, really, not very much, not in the same way that it is or was in the US. So,
Yeah. And I've often asked this question, and it's one that I've given some thought, even if I'm not an expert on the sort of international culture wars. But I would say this. The term, as you said, emerged in 19th century Germany in a struggle between Protestants and Catholics over like control of the state and the schools, and that is one important element of the culture wars in the United States. But I think what sets the American or U.S. American culture wars apart from others is precisely this question: what it means to be an American. I'm not sure to what degree, like, culture wars in France, which exist and are real over various issues, boil down to the question, what does it mean to be French? Perhaps to some degree. And I would also think that because of the cultural hegemony of the United States, I've seen culture wars. I've sort of read about culture wars in other nations, more recent iterations of them that seem very familiar to the culture wars in the United States. And I often wonder to what degree they're taking an American model for the culture wars, a U.S. American model, and sort of fitting them into their own particular
yeah.
niche cultures. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly kind of see that in Brazil, where there have been a lot of imported ideas and techniques and methods and forms of organization which come from, well, that the evangelicals took from the
Yeah.
U.S. evangelicals. I mean, there the line is pretty obvious. It does strike me, listening to the discussion, inevitably there's these war metaphors that emerge, and you're like when you're describing stuff, you're inevitably drawn to using, oh well, it's a skirmish, or they put their tanks on their lawn, or whatever, all these kind of things, and some are kind of more cliched than others. But it's interesting, it all sound the culture war, certainly Culture War 1.0 that you discuss mainly in the book from the 60s to the 90s, is one which looks a lot more like postmodern warfare, right? With lots of skirmishes, drive-bys, ongoing tension, but which explodes in little flashpoints at one border or another. Like imagine war in the Balkans or in the Caucasus or something over recent decades, much more than it is like World War II, and it's these mass armies clashing, and there's a front, and everyone kind of knows what's going on. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It seems like there's an ongoing kind of turmoil beneath the surface, which attaches itself to certain flashpoints. I mean, certainly that's the impression that I get in reading the chronology that you lay out.
Yeah. I haven't ever thought of it that way, but I think that's a useful metaphor. If we want to extend the sort of rhetorical militarization of these cultural battles. And if you want to extend it even further, you could say that maybe what we're now witnessing is something more approaching World War II, in the sense
Right.
that so oftentimes the alignments in the culture wars, especially in the 80s and 90s, did not always neatly coincide with the political electoral system. There were sometimes weird allies, such as, for example, debates over pornography attracted some pretty radical feminists to the side of evangelicals. And I'm not saying that doesn't ever happen now, but one thing that the culture wars have done, I think, in particular in the last 10 to 20 years, is has increasingly sorted people. And so, for example, and there's been a lot of sociological studies on this, for example, if you're conservative first, you are, and especially if you're a conservative Republican, you're more likely to be religious because you're conservative, and so you oftentimes will join a church, or you'll become an evangelical because you're conservative and because those alignments make sense to you. Whereas in the past, there might have been a lot of very religious, liberal, progressive Americans who are increasingly ditching religion because religious people to them are thought to be the types of, like, the Jesse Helms types um, who are trying to censor particular forms of art or that type of thing. And so you're seeing this pretty intense polarized alignment that I think comes out of the culture wars of the 80s and 90s, when things were much more, I guess, as you would say, much more guerrilla warfare style.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this is a question that I, in fact, had noted down. You already mentioned the case of pornography, which I pulled out, where you say it's one of the few instances where left-right partisanship was scrambled. But a little bit later on, you also mentioned homosexuality, where 60s liberals were previously of the opinion that sexuality was a free choice, and by the 1980s had become advocates more of nature rather than nurture, that you're born this way, and so on. And so there are these rare moments of scrambling of coordinates, and I wonder whether you. I'm kind of jumping ahead here and going against the interview script that I had laid out, but I can't resist asking already in comparison to the Culture Wars 2.0 of what we have today, whether you think that the combatants, right, whether each competing bloc is more consolidated today, or whether it was more consolidated in the past.
I think they're more consolidated today, for the reasons I previously mentioned about this sort of sorting mechanism of the culture wars, but also because um, both political parties, especially the Republican Party, but I would say both political parties, have leveraged the culture wars to their advantage to raise money, to draw attention to both their moral or virtues, but especially to draw attention to the dangers or evils of the other side. And so, although the Supreme Court has long been a sort of contentious issue in our political system, it's only grown more so because the Supreme Court has been sort of the arbiter of so many, the final arbiter of so many issues that sort of boil down to the culture wars. And so, I think the two sides are much more sort of sitting across each other from pretty dugout trenches now.
Right, right. I think that's the sense that I get. Your book accounts or recounts various of these skirmishes and looks at the publication of key books or intellectuals who made arguments. Do you have a sense at a kind of lower mass level how important these battles were to quote unquote ordinary people? And I obviously again have one eye on today and how the extent to which culture wars seem to draw everyone in, and I wonder whether these issues, particularly because a lot of them weren't, and obviously some of the questions about race, for example, would obviously be explosive and touch on kind of everyone's experience in the United States. But something about what the Smithsonian is showing, or about Piss Christ or whatever. I don't how how many
Yeah.
people actually cared about that.
Yeah, you might, the sense might be, or the sort of common sense might be, that not many people care about that. And of course, there's this whole sort of cottage industry of sociologists and political scientists who put out books during this time period saying most Americans don't care about these issues, and this is like an elite media-driven phenomenon. And I think to some degree it is an elite media driven phenomenon, although I think the media, or those partaking in the culture wars, were motivated by very real sort of like groundswell changes in society and in the culture. Here's how I think it affects everyday people. So, no, most people do not go to Stanford. They don't send their children to Stanford. And so, a national controversy over a freshman reading list at Stanford is not going to matter to the vast majority of people. But when you had the Secretary of Education at the time, William Bennett, traveling to Stanford to debate Jesse Jackson on the issue, this is going to sort of bring a lot more people to the issue, and a lot more people might care about it. When you have Rush Limbaugh on his radio program that millions of people listen to while they're driving to and from work, complaining that this represents the sort of like decline of Western civilization and represents the sort of problem that liberals or feminazis or whomever else he was blaming everything on was bringing to the nation, then you're going to get a lot of people who care about it. This is perhaps even more so now. I mean, anytime, as a sort of from an anthropological perspective, I tune into Fox News, there's a constant sort of like war on wokeness that's happening. Wokeness is not something that, if wokeness, whatever that is, this sort of like hard to pin down label for what used to be called political correctness, or just like anti-racism, anti-sexism. But wokeness is not something that affects most people in their everyday lives, unless you actually are an elite person who works in like elite university or media circles. And yet, because millions of especially elderly Americans tune into Fox News, they seem greatly concerned with this. And you can see the sort of equivalent on the other side of the and I think social media has just like exacerbated this, because the things that get clicks tend to often be culture war or culture war tangential issues.
Yeah.
And just to add to that, like, it's not just that people are being sort of propagandized to, although they are. It's that there's a sort of real sense that there's something at work here, something bad at work here amongst people, because people tend to think that they represent sort of freedom or justice in their values, and that these are sort of standing athwart of that.
Well, I mean, I wasn't going to go down this line, but I mean, wouldn't wokeness impinge on people's lives insofar as it's a method of kind of human resources style management of people,
Yeah.
and an also kind of interpolation for people to think of themselves in terms of their identities, and therefore that applies not just to things that are in the ether or things that are in the internet, or kind of thrown around by those who want to kind of have an argument online, but actually touches on and applies to and is carried out through the structures that people encounter, the structures and institutions that people encounter at work, at schools, etc.
I think, yeah, that's well said. Yeah. And I think so, maybe on an everyday life, it affects people even more now than it did in the 80s and 90s. Although I think, like, you can, here's a way in which the culture wars definitely seemed to affect lots of people in the 80s and 90s, and this is how they responded to it. The types of things being taught to children at the public schools, because so many millions of Americans, as elsewhere, have children, send them to public schools, and the expectation based on their experience in public education and their sort of general knowledge of what public schools do is that they were going to reproduce the values taught at home. And then that often is not happening, and increasingly so as teachers, as part of a larger sort of ecosystem of educational institutions, are growing increasingly secular and increasingly liberal, and that these values are being supported by Supreme Court decisions during the 60s and 70s. So lots of people, especially evangelicals, could feel at a very real level things changing, and that their values were being challenged on an everyday basis.
Right. I mean, it's interesting. I got the sense coming through the book, but especially now hearing you talk, that the new emergence of the new left, its object, and especially in terms of what it aimed to do in its more optimistic phase, right before its defeat, or before its lowering of expectations and turning to more exclusively cultural issues, and the period of the conservative backlash in the 70s, that still was a sort of political struggle which by the 1980s and 90s becomes just a culture war. Is that the way you understand the kind of weft of that history?
Yeah, I think so. So if you think about it in these terms, a couple of the central organizing principles of the New Left. Well, first of all, to end the war in Vietnam. The degree to which the New Left contributed to that is debatable, but certainly they did not. They failed to end, I guess, what you would say, like American aggression abroad or U.S. imperialism. And yet, many people who were very wrapped up in the anti-war movement moved into cultural institutions, and their values became, at times, in particular spaces in those cultural institutions, dominant or hegemonic, or at least had some influence there. And so they might have failed oftentimes at the more prosaic political level to achieve their ends. But their numbers, their existence, their ability to move into elite cultural spaces allowed for them to really challenge dominant frameworks in terms of cultural understandings and representations. And that's why, I mean, Todd Gitlin wrote a book in the 1990s in which he sort of glibly said that the left um, the left marched on Hollywood while the right took the White House, or something like that, or the left marched on English departments while the right took the White House, and making a very commonplace argument in that time period from some people on the left or liberals that the culture wars were a waste of our time. But I'm not sure I definitely don't think that's the correct way to view things, because oftentimes there weren't other avenues available to people on the left or sort of like cultural liberals to make the types of changes they wanted to make. And going into culture was one way to do that. And so they might have agreed with Pat Buchanan that culture was the Ho Chi Minh Trail to power.
Right. Yeah, my view is that they were all wrong. And certainly as after the 1960s, the hopes were dashed, and the terrain gets, or rather, political struggle gets shifted onto this terrain of culture, which we'll see where that turns up. And I mean in the space of the next 20 minutes or so. But before that, I wanted to ask you to maybe pull out another example from the late 1980s. The verb to bork entered the lexicon then, meaning to quash a judicial nomination, or by extension, to quash political opponents. Can you tell us this story? And the reason I ask for this example is I wonder, is there a logical link between culture war and judicialization?
Yeah, I think there is a link there. So the story, maybe many of your listeners are familiar, but if not, I'll just recount it very basically. Ronald Reagan in 1987 nominated Robert Bork to the Supreme Court. Bork, well, so some people, he was renowned as the person who carried out Nixon's sort of axing of the attorney general during the Watergate controversy, willing to do that. But he was probably better known amongst people who were aware of sort of debates over the courts as a conservative scholar of the justice system, who was one of the people who was extremely critical of the Warren and Burger courts, that is the Supreme Court since the 1950s, that had kind of gone above and beyond the legislative system to inscribe the constitutionality of rights, which included a number of things from Brown versus Board of Education, which desegregated schools in theory, to the Miranda versus Arizona, which gave rights to the accused, to Engel versus Vital, a 1962 decision which made prayer in school unconstitutional, to most notoriously Roe versus Wade. And because here's where because he had made all of these controversial issues during the course of his ongoing scholarly career at Yale as a critic of the courts, Democrats in the Senate, including Biden, had lots of ammunition to squash that appointment because he had written against civil rights, he had written against women's rights, and in the context of 1987, it was easy for them to squash his appointment, and thus to get borked becomes a sort of now a verb in the lexicon of American politics. And the right never forgave Democrats for this, and thus we're happy to return the favor several decades later at the end of Obama's administration. So the second part of your question is really interesting. One of the actual good points I think Bork and other critics of the Supreme Court during the Warren and Burger Court eras had, one of the criticisms that actually made sense is that the court was acting outside of the legislative process, thus outside of the democratic process, and serving as a sort of like higher up, almost arbitrary, monarchical arbiter of rights of laws. And so you could say that's at a basic democratic theoretical level, that makes sense. But you could also say at a more sort of practical, pragmatic level, it's a good criticism because these decisions are unlikely to stand the test of time if they don't represent the will of the majority. And I think because the court, especially the Supreme Court, has stood outside the legislative sort of democratic process, it has easily become the sort of like chief arbiter of the culture wars. And since Republicans or the right now controls the Supreme Court, you're seeing something very similar to what happened in the 60s. And that is that the court is making decisions that seem highly anti-democratic, that seem to stand against the will of the majority, and thus is kind of at the center of these culture wars.
Yeah, and I mean, it would be the case, I would guess, regardless, whatever majority opinion is. That, of course, is to a certain extent an artifact of surveys and polls and all the technicians of public opinion. But I guess it's all of this is a function of the only partial overlap between representative politics and culture war, that they're not the same thing. People often, I think, particularly observing U.S. politics from afar, people like to pretend that they are the same thing, and particularly a lot of the participants, because they have a lot of things to gain from it. For example, as you've already mentioned, getting funding, saying, we need the enemies at the gates, we need to ward them off, and so on. But I guess it's notable that so many of these struggles get funneled into judicial contestation, and I guess that must be an admittance, not deliberate, but an admittance that they cannot find, generate enough political will and the organization to see those things through representatively through to the legislator and to change the laws in their favor, right?
Yeah. So in 2004, Thomas Frank wrote a pretty famous, well-read, influential book called What's the Matter with Kansas? And this is exactly the argument he makes. And he focused in on his home state of Kansas in particular to note that Republican politicians in Kansas, when they were campaigning, would focus intensely on issues like abortion that seemed to rile up their base in places like Topeka. And yet, when they governed, they seemed to care much less about that and much more about lowering taxes for the rich.
Right.
It's a solid argument, correct on its face. I guess the problem I have with it, or had at the time and continue to have, I think, is that it sort of downplays, it treats culture wars as epiphenomenal, as superficial, as not really mattering, whereas I think they really do matter to a lot of people. And I think they're sort of like basic issues of what it means to be a human at stake in so many of the culture war issues. But it goes without saying that politicians will leverage anything, including culture wars issues, to their benefit, often opportunistically if they can do so. I think it also goes without saying that lots of politicians truly do believe in their own rhetoric when it comes to culture wars.
So before we get on to kind of comparisons with today and actually looking at at the contemporary culture wars, I wanted to ask firstly what the consequence of the culture wars was, certainly Culture War 1.0. You write in the final chapter proper, The Contested American Past, if the pitched rhetorical battles of the culture wars diminished the standing of historians and other university academics who sought to reshape the political sphere, these shouting matches decimated the position of those who managed the Smithsonian and other public cultural institutions. And I think that could probably go, I suspect, go for quite a lot of other things. Is the effect of the culture wars to somehow undermine the authority of institutions? Is that what you
I
take
think,
from it?
yes, that is definitely one of the intended or unintended major consequences of the culture wars. And insofar as, so in many ways, in terms of like attitudes, I think the left has won a lot of the culture war battles, or at least is it's kind of on the winning side of the ledger, but even as they continue to be contested. But when it comes to power and money, it seems like mostly a losing battle. So, for example, this is an argument I make in the new conclusion to the second edition of the book that I think holds true. And so, like, for example, during the 1980s, it seemed like left and right had these pitched battles over what type of humanities education we would have in the university and in the public schools. Both sides of the debate seemed at the time, at least those who were partaking in it, to truly believe in the value of a humanities education, even as they disagreed over what type of humanities education, what type of history, what type of literature should be taught. But nowadays, it seems to me that the winning argument on the right is that the humanities don't matter, or that because the humanities have been taken over long ago by Marxists who want all children to be trans or something like that, then we might as well just quit funding these things through the public coffers. And so, for example, the Florida legislation about 10 years ago introduced legislation to make at their public universities, make people who major in the humanities make them pay more tuition than somebody who's majoring in something more useful in their eyes, like business. And I think this is a sort of general attitude that has won out on the right and has made it extremely difficult in many places in the US to even have funds for things like history or public history.
Right. No, absolutely. I mean, though that was one issue, one kind of brief moment where I took issue, I think, with some of your portrayal, because I understand your argument that, in the battle between the cultural left and the cultural right over the 80s and 90s, the ultimate winner is just commercialism, effectively. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. Though I personally would be much more critical of the cultural left for having undermined humanities, for having undermined the status of knowledge and truth, to the extent that they were then indefensible in the face of a neoliberal onslaught that just simply sought to defund them.
I've grown pretty sympathetic to that argument. The extreme politicization of the humanities towards, for example, what you saw in the 80s and 90s, and which became perhaps even more so since then, like identity politics, has not helped. Has not helped. Like, making the humanities utilitarian in any fashion is going to diminish the basic premise of the humanities. I'm very sympathetic to that argument. Yeah.
So, one last question, I think, before we move to today. I keep tacking these on, but these questions keep suggesting themselves to me. Is your interpretation that the culture war was in some way necessary? I mean, you say that they were important, right? And these questions about who we are indeed important. And I don't disagree with you. I think my criticism would be that when politics becomes just that, you end up with a serious problem. But these are not questions which are somehow alien or should be completely removed from questions of who rules and who gets what, but also who we are inevitably is kind of implied by the answers to some of those other questions about power and distribution. But do you see the culture war as in some way necessary? And I mean necessary both in a normative sense as well as being inevitable.
Yeah.
Is what I assume you're sympathetic, obviously, to a lot of the new left claims around sexuality and gender and race, and I am as well, though I'm critical of the way that the new left ended up going. But do you see the kind of the fact that culture war is like such a major aspect of American history in the second half of the 20th century and up through to today, that was somehow inevitable?
Yeah, so we're trained as historians to sort of avoid arguments of an inevitability, and yet this is one of those instances where I can't help but think that this was almost inevitable in this sense. American mainstream society and culture, as it had developed over time leading into the post-war era, was liberal and open and tolerant in some ways, but deeply repressive in other ways, especially if you were Black or if you were gay. The list goes on. And so I think because society worked from a liberal premise, or politics worked from a liberal premise, at least statedly so, it was almost inevitable that groups would emerge to challenge this dominant framework in ways that would either include allow for their inclusion, or, as we saw, perhaps change entirely the dominant framework. Given that, I think it's also inevitable that there would be millions of people who would disagree with challenges to the dominant framework and would get organized to resist that. And so, like, the sort of basic framework of the culture wars, as I understand them, and how the left emerged to challenge the dominant, what I call normative America, and then how the right got organized to challenge that challenge, to me seems almost inevitable in the historical context in which it happened. It could have happened in a lot of different ways, and I don't necessarily think it's good per se in this sense. I mean, I happen to be much more, my own politics, much more of a sort of economic socialist, and I think it's very difficult to have a sort of democratic socialist politics in a polity that is so divided over cultural and identity issues. And so, like, overcoming that to me seems to be the biggest challenge to a left currently. But inevitable is something close to how I describe the culture wars. Yes.
Right. So Culture War 2.0, this is a bit, you suggest, I think, if I've read you correctly, that there was something that wasn't inevitable, that culture war only became about identity and about identity politics in the more recent period, in the past 2 decades or something like that.
Well, I think, going back to my just how I just answered the previous question, I think identity politics emerges in the 1960s, even though it's not called that at the time. That word doesn't begin to be widely used until the 1990s. But it emerged in the sense that people proclaimed Black identity, or their identity as a woman, as a way to not only sort of rally other people of that particular proclaimed identity, but also to sort of say, we're here and we matter and we are a part of American history. We're a part of American society. And that was nothing new, but also nothing new was the sort of like cultural pluralist side of this. And that is that these are distinct entities that exist and persist even independent of a larger sort of American identity or American society. That side of identity politics seems more pronounced recently than before, and there seems less interest in joining the American whatever society identity, sort of changing the mainstream to allow for different types of cultural expressions and identities. And rather, it seems, I hate to use this word, but more tribalistic than it was previously, perhaps. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you talked about sorting already, and about how and as I perceive it as well, that in Culture War 2.0, in our contemporary period, you have far more consolidated blocks as a consequence, that people are a certain type of person and they get filtered in, and there's a much greater alignment in terms of cultural preferences, consumption, skin color, perhaps, sexuality, whatever it might be, right? That all these things kind of align, and that you get much less kind of randomness across
Yeah.
the population, right? Is that something? Is that a sense that you have?
Yes, for sure. But even that's not set in stone. Like, I think we're just in a confusing moment with regards to everything we've been talking about, because even though we seem to all been sorted in very particular ways due to the culture wars, um, and a lot of this is regional as well. There's also this like small yet growing number of like young Black people who vote Republican, young Latino people who vote Republican.
Yeah, yeah,
So there are these sort of outliers that I think, because they're growing, need explaining and maybe trouble our sort of like increasingly conventional understanding of the sorting of American politics and culture.
yeah. No, that's interesting, and it's happening at the same time as almost total class de-alignment. It seems where both parties represent people across income levels equally, albeit they might draw from different sections in different industries or sectors or whatever. And I wonder how you understand the relationship between culture war and class. I mean, class doesn't appear very much in your discussion, and I assume that's because the materials said it's not important. Um, Through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, class doesn't seem to be very present in these debates. I don't know how you understand it, whether there is some class polarization which underlies the cultural polarization between progressives and conservatives. And then also by extension, whether you think today class has become more important in the culture war than before.
Yeah, if I were to write this book now, I might do it differently, in the sense that I think class does matter. But this is we spoke to this earlier. A lot of the voices in the culture wars are elite, not just in terms of cultural, like their cultural cachet, but also elite in terms of class. We're talking about people who tend to either be wealthy or just powerful, right? And whether they're and powerful by means of having a powerful political position, or by means of being like the president of Stanford or something of that sort. And I think that both sides, to some degree, at various points, leveraged arguments about class in order to sort of sell people on their version of the culture wars. Um, Oftentimes, conservatives sold their message as very populist. Like, the Democratic masses don't want funds going to support artists who are going to dunk the crucifix in a jar of their urine. It was like a democratic argument to some extent,
Mm.
and a class based argument, in the sense that, like, just basic working class Americans don't want this type of sacrilege. Um, while at the same time, you would have neoconservatives criticizing the culture of poverty that they saw emerging in the quote unquote ghettos of the United States, which was really a way to use culture to mask their actual class based and often race based arguments. So class is subterranean, class is there, but oftentimes culture wars operated as a way to cover over it, I think. Um, but because of various world events, including the financial collapse of 2008, the ensuing Occupy Wall Street, the various social democratic movements, including the Bernie Sanders campaign, class is much more prevalent on people's minds and right now. And I think this actually exacerbates the sort of militancy of the rhetoric of the culture wars, because it comes to seem much more existential. Some of these culture war arguments seem to be also rooted in just survival. But you're you make a good point about the sort of class de-alignment of the parties. The richest zip codes in the United States tend to be Democratic voting um, constituencies, and they tend to be some of the biggest donors to the Democratic Party. So the Democratic Party is both now a party of the labor movement, which is showing signs of emergence and militancy unlike any since the 1970s, and also the party of extremely wealthy professional liberals who live in places like Bethesda, Maryland. And that's a very tough sort of thing to reconcile. And I think one of the ways in which the Democratic Party, one of the reasons it might focus on culture war issues is because that's one way to reconcile this class disparity that's at the heart of their coalition. Similar things happening on the Republican side. They will tend to, and this is an old trick, but they will tend to emphasize the sort of like basic prosaic understandings of family life that millions of working class evangelicals have, while still in very real ways representing rich corporate interests.
Yeah. Who
Yeah.
do more to undermine the stability necessary for a family, and the
Yes.
kind of income necessary. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting. I think the triumph of populism, or maybe what's better called, popularism, which is something that I think you were kind of describing, that both sides in the culture war continue to refer to or identify the other as they, they as to use really old fashioned, like kind of the man, they're the ones who are in charge. We represent the multicultural, multi-ethnic, blah, 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 blah. And it's the old white guys. Now that isn't really true anymore. Very much so, and the other side will be like, well, it's the new class, it's liberals, it's the educated, and that's actually, it seems, increasingly true. Whether I mean, I don't want to endorse kind of politics which would follow that form of polarization, because it's a form of, it's culture war, and I'm against culture war. But it's a polarization which does seem increasingly accurate. And a lot of the debates we end up having, I think, on this podcast at least, revolve around just a kind of basic question of what's actually there and who's actually in power, or who's culturally hegemonic, because I think it varies country to country, and we talk about a whole range of different countries. It seems to me that, for example, in the UK, that the establishment is, liberal, for lack of a better word, like kind of left liberal or liberal, that it's economically liberal insofar as it's pro-market broadly, but it's also pro-bureaucracy and pro kind of cultural liberalism. And in the US, I always have a little bit of a harder time really grasping it, because it's much more kind of polycentric. Power is kind of more dispersed. It's less centered around a capital like London. And therefore, I don't know if it's simply saying, well, it's the liberals who are the liberals who have completely won and the liberals are completely in charge, or if there's an alternate pole of a kind of kind of right-wing populist nationalist counter elite now. I don't know how you would kind of characterize that. It's a tough question.
I mean, I think you're right that it's not as simple as saying there's a liberal elite that's in charge. There is a liberal elite, of course. That is hegemonic in many different avenues of American life, including the Democratic Party. But the United States is a huge country with varied economic and cultural interests, and not per se Trump, but many of the right-wing leaders, including Trump, they represent a different sort of pole of power. And so you could think of it in terms of like very basic robber baron politics. The Democrats seem to represent increasingly hedge funds, and although plenty of them, I'm sure, vote Republican for tax purposes, or the insurance industry or something of that sort. And Republicans seem to represent oil. Silicon Valley seemed to be a Democratic stronghold, but I think that's changed lately, and some of their leaders seem pretty keen on Trump politics. There's like professional elites in most big cities tend to be represented by the Democratic Party. But then there's this whole sort of suburban, exurban, professional, small business, kind of like sitting somewhere between bourgeoisie and proletariat that's very Republican, and there's millions of those types. So yeah, it's hard. There's power is not centered really anywhere except capital in the broad sense.
Right, of course, yeah, and which is certainly depersonalized, unlike these other examples that
Yeah.
you've given. I wonder, I mean, it ultimately, listening to all this, having read your book and thinking about this, is that kind of culture war is in some sense, certainly culture war in the sense that we know it now, which is to say, not necessarily about culture. It's about a type of political conflict which attaches itself in kind of symbolic ways to issues, even if they're not cultural issues. I mean, I always like to use immigration as an example, where it's like, that's not a cultural issue. I mean, it is only insofar as it's like who counts as a citizen, who counts as a national, etc. So it's kind of about culture, but it's a lot about other stuff. It's about jobs, it's about public services, it's about mobility, it's about a whole range of other things, right, which aren't about culture. And yet immigration is the hottest issue, certainly in European politics, and I think in U.S. politics. Obviously it varies up and down, but is always kind of in the top five or whatever issues, and that's something which is submitted to the logic of culture war, even if it's not necessarily a kind of cultural thing. And I'm trying to understand exactly what it is that makes it worth calling a culture war. And indeed, I wonder whether you think it is, whether it is a culture war.
Yeah. So one of the things I've noticed is that the culture wars of the 80s and 90s tended to more specifically stay within the realm of culture or representation. And we've seen it sort of slipping the boundaries of that ever since. And immigration maybe is a good example. But you see the arguments over immigration play out in culture war terms everywhere. When I taught in Denmark for a year, and I would talk to my students about the issue of immigration, and they made the case that, well, the thing that some Danes really oppose about Muslim immigration in particular is that they're just not going to fit in with Danish culture, in large part because they don't drink. And that drinking socially, publicly, is such an important part, as they defined it, of what it meant to be a Dane. So never mind, like you said, sort of mobility and resources and work and jobs, etc., which are really what you would think it would boil down to. It was these people aren't going to fit in with us. And maybe that's a way of saying that, like, lots of different political issues also have cultural attendance to it. But I also think it's true in the US and elsewhere that culture war has become the predominant mode of political communication or political battle, contestation.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I mean, we see it, I think, also with national conservatives, and there's a lot of, I find, kind of fear mongering around a political force which ultimately doesn't really do much. It makes things kind of slightly worse. But a lot of the I raised this, so let me put it the other way around, and to pick a very contemporary example. So I'd just been seeing this, I think, today on Twitter, and we're recording this on the Wednesday, the 4th of September. Listener, you're probably hearing this in a week or so. But another podcast called Martyr Made by Daryl Cooper, who's a kind of podcast historian, who's done apparently some good things. I think I've listened to one or two things, and I think they're interesting, but has now made these statements about World War II, kind of the type of thing which would be understood as a very far. Certainly as a right-wing interpretation of the Second World War, which emphasizes anti-communism and indeed is critical of the Allies' war against the Nazis because it wasn't directed enough against the communists, right? And it increasingly have these things, and I experienced this in Brazil with Bolsonaro, where a lot of the impact of what he did, which wasn't very much in practical terms, because he was kind of chaotic and a terrible politician, wasn't actually able to get very much done, was in reference to the past, right? So was had an impact, I think, insofar as people's understanding of what the dictatorship was, and something which was understood in the kind of democratic consensus post 1988 was that the dictatorship was bad, but it was never really fully dealt with. It was kind of swept under the rug. It wasn't like in Argentina where they properly held the generals to account. And as a consequence, the contribution of national conservatives is to change our understanding, or force a kind of break taboos, at least. Let's put it this way: break taboos with regard to the past. And Giorgia Meloni's done the same thing in Italy. She's not going to do anything radical. She's actually kind of boringly Atlanticist, neoliberal, blah, 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 blah. She's not even going to take Italy out of the EU. But what she is doing is being like, well, Mussolini, he was kind of, he wasn't that bad, right? And I wonder whether that tells us something a little bit about why culture war has returned today. Like it's a kind of it's where politics goes to die, or where it's where politics goes when other kind of political avenues are blocked, right?
Yeah. So, like, would you say culture war is the predominant mode of political contestation or communication when one system is dying and another has yet to come into being? I mean, maybe that's one way to think about it. Because I tend to think neoliberalism is dying in that its rhetoric, its arguments, its whole justification, not many people buy it anymore on either side or at any point on the political spectrum. Yet the system itself is still just sort of chugging along. And so maybe, I mean, this is speculation, but we're on a podcast, so we might as well speculate.
That's maybe the place for it.
Yeah. Maybe culture war and like these sort of like radical revisions to basic historical understandings might be a way to sort of think about how a new system could come into being, or contemplation, or subterranean, subconsciously.
Right. Yeah. No, I think, I mean, that's interesting to explore. I wanted to draw this kind of to a close. I'm going to go back to then go forward. What comes through in the book, and I think you've already hinted at this, is about the undoing of liberalism in some ways from the 1960s onwards in the US. Liberalism, classically understood, not understood as economic liberalism as it is in Europe, or as kind of left liberal progressivism as it is in the US, but classical liberalism. And you get it. The understanding that I have is that the left abandons liberalism, right, by identifying institutions or even epistemologies as no longer neutral, as hopelessly biased, as complicit with all the worst things of history, which is a break with the perspectives of the old left, of classical Marxism, I think, as well, right? And the right also, I think, breaks with liberalism. To a certain extent, it adopts it by adopting things like color blindness, which it used to be like, the right used to be all about race. Like, yeah, we look at things through color tinted lenses, and then it starts adopting color blindness as a way to combat the new left's adoption of identity and endorsement of black nationalism, for example, etc. Or, in other regards, the right also kind of abandons its liberalism as well, right? In the development of the neoconservative movement, it certainly does. It becomes explicitly anti-secular and things like this. So I found it interesting rereading that history as a story of the breakup of liberalism. Particularly in today's time, where there's a lot of talk about the breakup of liberalism, and as one writer calls it, the actually existing post-liberalism, which is kind of what we have today. And so I wonder whether there's an answer to the culture wars, which is just a classically liberal one. So you to draw one more thing from the book as a way to trying to stitch together this argument. You point out that in the 80s and 90s campus wars, you had on opposite sides Frantz Fanon and John Locke as examples of things that the left and the right respectively thought that undergraduate humanities students should be reading, and that nowadays you find Frantz Fanon and John Locke on the same side against the technocratic problem-solving perspectives of contemporary Philistines. And so I wonder whether there's a way that the kind of response to the culture war would be a kind of liberalism of some sort, which would maybe seek to rebuild or to build new institutions on a new basis, on a more collective one and a more representative one.
Yeah, a lot there. I think what died from the 1960s onwards was what I would call mid-century liberalism or Cold War liberalism. And it got attacked from both left and right for the various reasons you point to. Mid-century liberalism was indeed liberal in that it proclaimed pluralism and small d democracy and free speech as central to its value system, as central to the way in which politics should operate. And yet the left noticed all of these very real sort of like gaps or hypocrisies in the way in which it was practiced, and pushed at it to the degree that I think many on the left gave up on liberalism, turned anti-liberal, especially with regards to mid-century liberalism's imperialism, its war in Vietnam, etc., but also with regards to its colorblindness. Although there are a host of historians, especially who are mid-century liberals, who argued that U.S. has always been liberal, and that's the main thing about being an American, is being liberal, whether you call yourself a conservative or a liberal. I would argue that there's always been a sort of anti-liberalism in American politics that we call the right, but that mid-century liberalism, not entirely, but for the most part, satisfied a lot of conservatives, just enough that they wouldn't break with liberalism. But I think as mid-century liberalism began to break apart in the Democratic Party, and what's known as liberalism began to embrace, I guess, more radical elements like identity politics, and became much more secular, because mid-century liberalism was not necessarily a secular entity. It was it was more secular than previous versions because it embraced Catholicism and Judaism, but it wasn't atheist. And the later liberalism became much, much more deeply secular. As this happened, the illiberalism that I think was inherent to the American right came more to the surface. And so the center could not hold, insofar as the center was this mid-century Cold War brand of liberalism. And in terms of the history of liberalism, it's been a bit chaotic since then, hasn't it? But I think the thing that did emerge with neoliberalism, as you mentioned, was the sort of like technocratic, meritocratic liberalism that became the sort of like hegemonic thing, but that lots of people were always, on both left and right, dissatisfied with. I don't know how or whether liberalism could return on some sort of basis that would please enough people. It's a difficult question for me. It's a difficult sort of proposition for me to imagine.
Yeah, I mean, or even, I mean, maybe liberalism is too, not loaded, but, points in too many potential directions to be understood clearly. But some sort of American proposition about what it means to be American, tied back from the American Revolution onwards, which of course would alienate a lot of the the children of the New Left, no doubt, but also perhaps many conservatives, but would be able to conquer some demographic majority, at least as against. One line I just wanted to say, before we close, that today's ethos is Madison Avenue in Silicon Valley, multiculturalism as a milk toast commodity. Such are the cultural contradictions of liberation, which I thought was a neat way to put it. Though I would suggest that it's not the cultural contradictions of liberation, but the contradictions of cultural liberation. That's what happens if you pursue liberation only in cultural terms. That's where you end up.
Point well made. Yeah.
But maybe we'll leave this here, unless you kind of have any other comment.
I'm good to leave it here. We dove deep into a lot of interesting, very sort of like central things to the culture wars. So fun.
Fantastic. All right, Andrew, thank you very much for joining me. This has been such an interesting discussion, and I've got to go away and take a bunch of notes.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Hey, cheers.